Hello, welcome to the iClone 5 tutorial on lighting. Here you're going to get an introduction on how you can use the lighting tools and options available in iClone 5 to give your scene the best possible look. You'll see that lighting makes a big difference. What I have here first is a scene of a woman in a chair. And as you can see, I'm going through the different default lights in the scene manager and turning them on and off. As I do so, you can see the arrows indicating the direction of the light as well as the color. The last light on is a spotlight, which I'll get more into later. Right now, let's just change this to a directional light. You can notice a change in the lighting, mostly that the whole scene is now a bit brighter. If I have my light selected in the scene manager and I use the E hotkey, I can change the direction which the directional light is coming from. Okay, let's switch it back to a spotlight. When I change back, the spotlight will no longer be focused on the main scene objects now. If I press the F hotkey, the camera will now give a close-up view of that light. So now I can zoom out and use the movement keys W and E to rotate and move my light back into place. If your gizmo is not toggled on, simply press Ctrl Q. You'll see a solid edge on the far reach of the spotlight. The reason this is there is because of the spotlight's range settings, which you can see that I can change by adjusting the slider here. Also, there is the decay option, which blends the outline of your spotlight significantly. Adjusting the angle value will give you a wider or more narrow spotlight beam. The fall-off intensity determines the intensity focus of your spotlight, like you see here. If you want to move your spotlight without zooming in and out of your scene, you can adjust its various positional values here. This is often a less troublesome way to make quick adjustments if your spotlight is nearby your viewing area. In this next scene, I've switched on one of the directional lights. I can change the color of the light easily by just going up to the color swatch at the top and selecting a color of my choice. In addition, spotlight and directional lights can easily be animated. I'll just move the timeline ahead here, change the rotation of my directional light, and then play back. You can create some really cool effects such as sunset lighting by doing this. You can see that at this angle, I have a spotlight that's in the way of my camera. If I want to hide that, I can just do so quickly in the scene manager. Let's change the light color back to something a bit less red and back to white. In addition to changing the spotlight color, you can also change the ambient light. For this, you just need to access the ambient light swatch and switch over that to another color. Let's try blue this time. You can change your shadow opacity as well by using the opacity slider, as you see here. Blur is another important shadow value. If I turn it off and zoom in, you can see that my shadows on the chair will become pretty jagged. I'll toggle blur back on, and you can see that it looks a bit better now. You can also adjust the amount of blur like I'm doing here. Now to look into different shadow types. You can see right now that my character's shadow type is self-cast. Let's switch this to the next one called drop shadow. This type of shadow takes up less resources and is good to use when you need speed. Next, there is the wall shadow. You won't be able to see this unless your camera is rotated to the right angle against the outer limit of your project. You can also change the opacity of this and modify the X and Y offset to get the desired results. When you have self-cast shadow on, there are a number of other settings you can access. You can see in this scene that the shadow is a little jagged. To improve this, one thing I can do is increase the resolution of the shadow. Quality partition divides the quality of shadows that are closer or further away from the camera. You can see that if I raise it, the statue's shadow gets better, while the shadows in the hills get a bit rougher. The shadow range feature is especially useful when you're using a broad scene, but only a small area will be shot with the camera. Decrease the shadow range so any objects beyond the range will not cast any shadows while increasing the shadow effect for nearby objects. To get the best results, you can always increase the shadow resolution to the highest setting. Adjusting bias will refine the positioning of the shadows. A value further from 0 will result in more displacement. Bias is also useful for adjusting strange-looking or unwanted shadows. This next scene deals with alpha thresholds of objects and their shadows. This clock here has a gradient opacity map, so if I want, I can change the alpha threshold settings to determine what level of opacity in the scene it is. As you can see, if I lower my alpha threshold, more of the clear area will become visible on the screen. If I use shadow threshold, the shadow opacity can be modified separately from the alpha threshold to still cast a semi-transparent shadow. I'll go up and change the opacity map to show you again with a different example. If I take the alpha threshold down, more of the layer will show, while raising it slowly makes the layer dissipate. The shadow threshold setting does the exact same thing, this time only with the shadow. Next, I'm going to add some ambient occlusion here. You can find the option in the atmosphere section in the Modify panel. Ambient occlusion is a shading method used in 3D computer graphics that helps to add depth and realism to objects by recalculating the effect of light on the object. You can see that right when I toggle it on, the scene will have more depth. If I adjust the strength, it will make the shadows darker and thicker, while the range slider will spread out the shadowing a bit more, and the distance slider makes subtle changes to the distance that the dark shadows occupy on the object's surface. So now let's take this scene with a pool table and lamp and see if we can improve the lighting a bit. You can see that I have my spotlight positioned inside this overhead lamp, which I can move around. I'll make that invisible and then check the multiplier settings at the top, which will change the intensity of the light. If I put them up to 5, it's a bit too bright. And maybe 1 is a bit too dark. So let's just leave it at 1.2. I'm going to leave the range somewhere in that area. But this time, I'll use the decay settings to fade the light a bit to give it more of a gingy feel. I'll also adjust the angle and fall off to something a bit more appropriate, like you see me doing here. Now let's change the color of the lighting a bit. I can go up to the color swatch and switch it to red, but perhaps that's a little too seedy, so maybe I'll lighten it up to a lighter red. Now about the shadow. I want a bit more detail and depth, so I'm going to switch from drop shadow to self-cast shadow. You'll see I get a bit more detail to my shadow this way, especially in and around the table. You'll notice though that the cue ball has a bit of a misplaced shadow. The reason for this is because the bias has been set to -10. If you want to adjust this, you can just enter in a lower value like I'm doing here. You'll see that the shadow will get closer and closer to the object, the lower the value I enter. Next, I'm going to add some ambient occlusion here. And that's about it. When you get the final results that you want, you can add a camera and create a quick flyby to view your results. Lighting is an essential part to making any scene look good, so fool around with it and see what you come up with.